Close your eyes for a second and forget the paintings. No uniforms, no drum lines, no heroic portraits. Just a small house on Long Island, 1776. Dawn. Smoke from a cooking fire. A mother waking her kids. A grandfather checking the shoreline he has known his entire life. Then the sound starts. Distant at first. Low. Rhythmic. Oars. Cannons. Hundreds of boots. The British invasion of Long Island didn't arrive on empty land. It came straight into native homelands that had already been carved up, fenced off, and sold out from under the people who lived there. And for Indigenous families on both sides of Long Island Sound, this war wasn't just about who ruled a colony. It was about whether they would still recognize the places that made them who they were. By the 1770s, native nations like the Montaukett, Shinnecock, and Unkechaug were still here, still raising children, planting fields, fishing the coves their ancestors had named. But the land under their feet had already been shrinking for generations. Imagine watching the map of your world close in, one fence at a time. First, the best planting ground goes. Then the meadow where your grandparents gathered medicine. Then the trail to the shellfish beds. On paper, the land becomes lots, pastures, improvements. In real life, it's your cousin losing hunting ground, your mother walking farther every season to find clean water, your family's burial hill suddenly inside someone else's farm. The revolution didn't start this story. It arrived in the middle of a long emergency that native families were already living through. When the first shots of the revolution rang out, most native communities tried to stay out of it. They had seen European wars before. They knew that when empires fight, native families bleed either way. Picture a council fire. People arguing in two languages at once, English and their own. Do we stay neutral? Do we help the crown, hoping it slows the land grab? Do we gamble on the rebels and a new country? Every path comes with risk. Help one side and the other calls you traitor. Refuse both and you're called suspicious, untrustworthy, enemy. For Long Island native families, these aren't abstract choices. They're deciding which son might be taken as a scout, which daughter will be left behind if the village has to move again. Silence around that council fire isn't peace. It's people trying to choose between bad futures. After August 1776, Long Island becomes a military machine. Officers need houses. Soldiers need barns. Horses need fields. So the army takes them. Think about what that looks like on the ground. You wake up to find soldiers measuring your pasture. Your church becomes a barracks. The common grazing land becomes a fort. Most accounts talk about civilians suffering through requisitions and martial law. But native families are in these same towns, only with less land, fewer legal rights, and almost no way to say no. If you already live on a tiny corner of what used to be your homeland, and the army takes the surrounding fields and woods, the loss is not just less land. It's the difference between feeding your children yourself and depending on a system that has been pushing you out for 100 years. Before the war, the sea was a road. Boats crossed Long Island Sound, carrying fish, corn, firewood, wampum, news, and visiting relatives. Families were stretched across both shores, Long Island and Connecticut, tied together by water, not separated by it. Then, war turns the Sound into a checkpoint. Patrol boats, blockades, spy fever. Now imagine you're a native parent in a small coastal village. Your brother lives across the water. Your cousins bring you tools, cloth, and stories from the other side. Suddenly, that simple crossing could get your boat searched, your goods taken, your son arrested as a smuggler or spy. A trip for a wedding or a funeral can end with soldiers asking, "Who are you? What side are you on?" At the same time, disease rides those same routes, packed into overcrowded camps, prison ships, army hospitals. You hear which families have lost a child, then a grandparent, then a whole household. War doesn't just redraw borders on a map. It reaches into kitchens and longhouses and says, you don't move freely anymore. You don't choose your own risks. Across the water in Connecticut, native families are living a parallel story. Pequot, Mohegan, Paugussett, Schaghticoke. Communities squeezed onto small reservations and scattered homesteads inside a colony that has already claimed most of their land. Think about what it means when the state appoints an overseer to manage your community's land and money. Your family's fields, your firewood, your burial grounds, now under someone else's signature. During the war, native men enlist in Connecticut units, sometimes for pay, sometimes for survival, sometimes to protect what little home they have left. But in the records, they are often just Indian or folded into free people of color. For their families, their service is not just patriotic. It's a last attempt to anchor themselves to a place that is trying to write them out. With the British on Long Island and patriots in Connecticut, the sound between them becomes a militarized frontier. Every crossing, by native or non-native travelers, can mean questions, searches, even being pushed out of a town where your ancestors are buried. Then, suddenly, it's over. Treaties are signed in distant rooms. Maps are redrawn. Men in wigs decide where empires end and begin. No native representatives are at that table. No one is asking, what about the families whose land we fought on? On Long Island and in Connecticut, the war's end doesn't feel like a fresh start. It feels like a tightening. Debts are called in. Questionable land deals move forward. Communities find more of their territory sold, seized, or reclassified. For a native family, that might mean this. You go to plant where your parents did, and a fence is there. You visit an ancestor's grave and find it on someone else's deed. And because records have started calling you something else, colored, mulatto, free person of color, the law pretends you are no longer who you say you are. The cannons go quiet. The land loss does not. If you try to follow these families through the archive, the trail keeps dissolving. A woman is listed as Indian in one town. Her children show up later as Negro in another. Her grandchildren appear only as free people of color on a militia list or a poor roll. On Long Island and in Connecticut, native people are still there, working on whaling ships, leasing land, doing day labor, caring for each other on shrinking reservations. But the labels blur them out just enough that later readers can say, they must have disappeared. To find them, you have to read against what the record thinks it's saying. Follow surnames instead of categories. Track movements across the sound. Notice every unimportant note in the margin. Because what looks like a quiet page, a list of debts, a ship's crew, a town's poor, might actually be the only surviving glimpse of a family trying to hang on. The British invasion of Long Island made thousands of patriot families into refugees. But for native families, the crisis was older and deeper. The war tightened a grip that had been closing for generations. So when a refugee family stepped onto a Connecticut shore, they were not landing in a blank space, waiting to be settled. They were stepping into a landscape where Indigenous families were already fighting to stay on what little remained of their homelands. In our next episode, we'll follow some of those refugee stories. We'll highlight women's experiences, running households in crisis, making the decision to flee, caring for children during the crossing, and rebuilding social networks in new towns.